So in 1997, when Sig Sauer GmbH, the German Sig Sauer, took over Blaser, they knew that they had to move this platform out of the competition world and into the police and tactical world. That was a strategic marketing decision that they made. And the first thing that happened was they tried to take a bunch of older rifles, basically first generation rifles, and sell them to North American civilians and police departments as R93 Tacticals and as long-range sporters like this one, LRS right here. And that was, kind of a half measure. They wanted to clear out some of their existing stock. They had a bunch of rifles made. They sold in very small numbers between 1997, probably about 1999. But the Sig Sauer and Blaser engineers knew that they needed to redesign the rifle and get rid of all of the peculiarities that had made it suitable for competition but weren't suitable for rugged use. So that's when the second generation rifle was debuted, and it was called the Long Range Sporter 2. And it essentially is very similar to the first generation rifles. I mean, in all intents and purposes, if you look at it in terms of dimensional standpoint, the rifles are almost identical. You can see that they share the same geometry. The stock is relatively the same. Even some of the aesthetic features have been kept the same. If you were to put these literally back to back, I mean, they're within a few millimeters of one another when it comes to the dimensions. And what the Sig Sauer engineers did was they said, okay, we need to ruggedize this. So they got rid of essentially the entire stock. They kept the physical dimensions and most of the features, but they decided to create essentially what is an overmolded aluminum chassis, whereas the original was just basically a giant billet piece of aluminum. The top rail here essentially is aluminum, and that is basically only about an inch deep, and it is inletted into the stock, and it makes up the actual receiver rails. But everything underneath this line here is essentially a overmolded aluminum, machined aluminum stock. So aluminum is on the inside, but on the outside at every point it is completely covered with a kind of a, I wouldn't call it a Glock polymer. The first generation was more like a Glock polymer. It's very hard. This is more of a rubberized polymer. And it was a great idea because this material is extremely rugged and rigid. And it also has a little bit of give to it. So it almost has like a kind of a self-healing property. You can scratch it and come back 20 minutes later and it's almost like, the scratch disappeared. It's really weird. They retained all of the features, really. It still had adjustable length of pull via spacers. It had an adjustable comb that was even very similar to the first generation comb. But they got rid of all of the tool adjustment features. To adjust the stock on the original, you needed a series of Allen wrenches. On the new militarized design, they basically made it so that everything is hand adjustable. Interesting enough, they did add this kind of peculiar, basically a hand shelf to the stock, which is more of a kind of what I would consider to be a competition rifle feature. You don't see that a lot on military and police rifles, and of course the first generation did not have that. It's just completely smooth on the bottom here. But it's extremely ruggedized and it's well designed. It feels really good. You can adjust it for right and left hand use. Everything on both of these rifles is, both the first and second generation series, is completely ambidextrous. And then, of course, the biggest thing that they changed was to go with a completely different magazine design. And instead of having a magazine that rode up and down inside the mag well, they ditched it for these composite magazines that have these stainless steel feed lips that actually move up and down inside the magazine. So this still allows you to feed around directly into the chamber, and then when the bolt slides over the top, it ducks down. So this was a lot more reliable, and they also went to a single stack design. One of the features that's very heavily criticized on the first generation rifles is the dual stack design. It just wasn't a very high quality design, and it led to a lot of issues with feeding. The LRS2, the second generation rifle magazines were 100% reliable in my opinion. So after a few years of this, between about 2001 when they were debuted until the outbreak of all kinds of conflicts in the Middle East, the LRS2 sold very well. It sold to a bunch of police departments. You know, I'm talking police departments around the world, Europe, North America, Southeast Asia, and it was received very well. The only problem is that during, especially like engagements in Afghanistan, snipers were asking for the 338 Lapua cartridge. And 338 Lapua was a problem for Blaser and the R93 platform, because essentially the R93 is a multi-caliber rifle. You can have any caliber from a rimfire up to a really large African big game hunting cartridge like a 458 lot or something like that, but it's not quite big enough to accept the 338 Lapua cartridge. And the problem is that the first generation rifles and the LRS2 both use a 1 1/8 inch, roughly 1 1/8 inch barrel shank, and 338 Lapua needs something larger. So what Sig Sauer decided to do, or to instruct Blaser to do, was to create essentially a large chassis version of the second generation rifle. So all LRS2s are R93s through and through. They're almost exactly the same to the original rifles, but they are limited to everything but the 338 Lapua cartridge. And of course everything is interchangeable essentially from the first generation to the LRS2. Blaser created a large chassis version that had originally sold as the R93 LRS2 338 Lapua Magnum. And what they did was they essentially took the barrel shank from the usual 1 1/8 inch up to a 1 3/8 inch size, and that was more than enough to handle the 338 Lapua cartridge. And that model, the LRS2 338 Lapua, was sold all over the world between probably about 2001 till about 2005. The only problem was a little bit confusing to describe exactly how it was different from the LRS2, because the LRS2 could accept any R93 accessory barrel. The 338 Lapua version was essentially a white elephant. It had a barrel and a shank and a larger chassis than the regular LRS2, and it was not interchangeable with any of the R93 platform accessories, calibers, bolt heads, all that stuff. So the 338 Lapua, it satisfied the niche or that Blaser was going after, that Sig Sauer was going after, which was police and military sales, but it was still a little bit difficult to understand how it related to the regular LRS2 R93 line. So essentially, the salesperson had to say, okay, you want 338 Lapua, you're going to have to live with this kind of standalone rifle, and if you want the regular R93 caliber interchangeability, You can have it in, 20 different calibers. We'll support it with, they had at least over a half dozen different magazines for some of those calibers. Some of them were single shot, but that was the LRS2.